Hello guys, I thought I would put together a kind of tutorial on sections. I want to put together a number of things just as a kind of resource that you can come back to. So, if I'm never on site, or ever not on site, probably I should say, because I will be on site, I just kind of wanted to go through a few things as you're thinking about sections and then drawing, just because otherwise it can become a bit of an anxiety if you're not sure where to go with something. Obviously, you can always come back to your supervisor and say, what about this, what about this? But I'll start with the kind of finishing up your section, and then we'll go from there. So here we are in Trench 14. This is the drainage trench B, if you like, within Trench 14. And we've got to the stage here of cleaning up the section and seeing what we've got. And so you can read some of the layers because they're quite obvious, particularly the dark charcoal band across the whole of the section there. You can see that sort of running all the way along. And when we've taken this down, we've taken it down in layers one by one, which is what you've been doing in terms of what you can see colour-wise. And it was fairly simple in this one in that the colours were quite different. The fabric was quite different of the material we took out. But we finished up here by troweling up and down and just making sure that this section is as vertical as we can get it, in order that when we draw it, it's as clear as we can get it. And it's worth, I think, once you've troweled up and down, just to get a bit of colour coming in there, to actually just start scoring in layers. You can see I've scored in some like that, just to help you later on when you're drawing it. Obviously, when you've got walls, they clean up really nicely and they're much easier to draw. But when you've got soft archaeology, it's just really worth, particularly if you've got rain coming or other weather changes that might muck up the colours and what you can see. It's good to just score things in. So anyway, once you've got to this stage, so you've cleaned up your section nicely, it's vertical, and then you're thinking, oh, I'm not quite sure what's going on. What you can do is you've scored it up as best as you can see it. Then it might be worth, if it's quite difficult in terms of what you're seeing, just creating a draft sketch of your section. And then, you can actually just send that to the supervisor, whether Peter or myself, just to check, does this make sense? You can see where the material meets the wall. There's always going to be a relationship there, but that might not be clear if it's a vertical section between the two. You don't know which came first. Did the wall come first, or did the material next to it? So unless you've got cut lines that show, then it's quite hard to know sometimes. But you can come to that later anyway in terms of matrices. But it's always worth just sketching out something and looking at it and asking yourself, does it make sense? Does it make sense for a vertical section or a tip line? Does that make sense in the way it's been deposited? Because you've got to think, how does sediment deposit, particularly if it's sand? Sand won't deposit in vertical sections. You won't have that unless it's abutting something like a wall. And even have a think through the order of events, because, for instance, in this section we've got a charcoal band that's really stark there running across, and that is an event that's occurred with some burning. We've got heat affected stone here, and the clay above it is also cooked. So clearly in the deposition of that clay, either the clay was put down with cooked material or heated material, or the stone was still the brick was still really hot when the clay was deposited. So you could say that these things are associated. You've got a burnt layer, you've got cooked brick, and you've got heat-affected stone, at least on the surface here. So whether this feature here is associated with the burnt layer or not, it's at least affected by the burnt layer, because the top is. The inside isn't necessarily, but the top is. So you can just think through these things. Also, the walls are sitting on that burnt layer on both sides. The walls are both parallel, and they're both sitting on the same material, which suggests they're of the same structure and the same time period, because they're later than the burnt material. I mean, so they could be completely unaffected. They could be completely new phases. You've got clearly a burnt phase earlier, and then you've got a structural phase later. I think it's also worth noting where you can see in plan, for instance, this surface. It also seems to marry up with a divide in the wall there. There's a sort of an unnecessary upright slate there, and it's almost like that section has been filled in later, and it seems to be in line with this surface. So perhaps there was a pathway that went through the wall, and then it was later blocked up. So just have a look around your slot when you're cleaning up as to kind of relationships and what makes sense in section and plan, just putting the two things together. Anyhow, probably one of the most helpful things is to put together a sketch just before you draw your section, just to get some idea of what's going on and get your head around it. And this is generally what I will be doing when I'm drawing together any of the drawings that we've done, as I'm looking at, is it making sense in section and is it making sense in plan? What is sat on what? You can't have a layer that's both below and above something, unless whatever is within is just a lens within that deposit. But generally it's more helpful, unless you've got a mixed deposit, to have them as separate layers. So anyway, this will give you just some idea as for kind of thought processes as you're going through, how am I going to draw my section? But yeah, you can always check in with the supervisor as to what you feel you've got, just to make the process of drawing your section easier. Just to be able to process with the supervisor.